Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kusum Wijetilleke. I'm a member of the Samagya Jana Balavega Working Committee, and I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Mahim Mendis and Attorney at Law Upul Jayasuri for inviting me and having me here today, and thank you all for your time as well. I want to start by just discussing what my colleague just said about demagoguery and where it has led our country. Now, 2019 is a perfect example. The electorate was suffering from the inertia of a public administration, the failure of the economy, and in intelligence and security failures that led to the deaths of 250 people. And from those tragedies and mismanagement, we got the demagogue of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Now, you can see a similar demagogue in power at the moment. Not only has he managed to concentrate power in a similar manner to Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he's gone above the power exercised by Mr. Gotabaya. He's the Minister of Defense, he's the Minister of Finance, he's a lead negotiator with the IMF, he's involved in the debt restructuring negotiations, and there is very little check on his office. As the executive president, he walks into Parliament and the legislature. Whenever he wants, he makes a speech, and he appoints people to high positions without any care for what their experience is and what the need of the hour is. The other option that voters will be faced with in the upcoming elections is someone who seems to also portray that same level of demagoguery. What do you see with President Ranil Wickremesinghe in his team? You see members of the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna who are now preaching the counter opposite of the things that they were saying less than 2 years ago. Why is that? It's because they have a new leader, a new demagogue. So in a similar way, we have another demagogue and a group of people that are following him almost unquestioningly. It is what's called blind faith. And I'm afraid that when you read the speeches written by the president, if you watched the performance of his State Minister of Finance, Shehan Semasinghe, at a recent debate organized by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, he was asked very plainly, what are your plans for growth? And he reverted back to the story of stability and everything the government has achieved so far. He was asked a second time, what is your plan going forward? What would you do differently? He once again responded that Ranil Wickremesinghe had rescued this country from the depths of despair and that we are in a stable environment now and that we need to grow. So even coming into a debate, knowing these questions, he had no answer. Now you can read the Manifesto from the National People's Power and the JVP. Again, it's a manifesto that's devoid of any substantive and realistic answers to the questions that we have. If you go through the manifesto, you'll read about tax incentives, tax holidays, and tax breaks for almost every sector of society and business. But you don't find anything about the revenue sources and how they're going to fund these tax breaks. Now, again, coming back to the aspect of demagoguery, ask yourselves who is the financial expert, the economic expert, who is going to negotiate from the NPP with the IMF, who is going to negotiating our debt restructurings with our creditors. The NPP has also made the claim that they're going to bring forward a fresh debt sustainability analysis. Now, if they felt that the original DSA had mistakes and needs improvement, those improvements they could have started doing a year and a half ago or a year ago. Now they tell us on the eve of the election that they're working on a new DSA and it'll be released soon. So I'll leave that up to the audience at home whether you believe this or not. The fact of the matter is that any interventions with the current IMF program has severe consequences for Sri Lanka's short-term liquidity and solvency. We may have differences of opinion with the debt restructuring program, with the targets imposed by the IMF, with the debt restructuring deals. But remember that any media utterance that you make related to the DSA has an impact on the yields of Sri Lanka's bonds. Sri Lanka's bond yields are directly related to how much money our government has to service our debt, and also how much is left for social services, health, investment, etc. So we can't upset the global financial markets and make promises that we're not even sure we can keep. But there is no question that while we implement the reforms and attain the broad targets of the IMF, that Sri Lanka must, under an SGB government, when we have access to the IMF's technical assistance reports, which have still not been released to the opposition, once we have an idea of what the assumptions that the IMF have made regarding debt sustainability, we can actually investigate that claim and understand if by 2030 our debt is going to be sustainable. Because remember, right now, according to the IMF's own projections, and I invite members of the audience watching at home to go to the IMF website and take a look at their projections for Sri Lanka. By 2030 and 2032, Sri Lanka will have a debt to GDP of 95%. Sri Lanka will have more external debt than we do today, and we'll have a higher external debt to GDP than we do today. But yet the IMF has told us that our debt will be sustainable by this point. Now, anybody who was paying attention in 2016 will remember that the Yahapalne government went in for IMF program when debt to GDP was under 80%. So now, with about $15 billion extra in external debt, with another few billion to be added by 2030, we are being told that debt will be sustainable by 2030 or 2032. So my fear, and the fear of a lot of economists, is that even by 2030, 2032, our debt will not be sustainable. So we would have undergone 5 years of a fiscal adjustment with deep pain for a large majority of people, and we would not even have accomplished our main goal of having our debt being sustainable. And all this is in the context of Sri Lanka now becoming one of the most unequal places in the world. We are in the top 5 most unequal countries in the Asia Pacific. The top 1% of Sri Lanka's income earners own 30% of total private wealth, and the bottom 50% own less than 4%. Those are the United Nations Development Programme's figures. That's not a personal opinion. In this context, we have seen that the NPP and the JVP, which is an explicit Leninist Marxist party, are also in the first or second slot, depending on which poll or which survey you believe. So this represents another adjustment and a sea change from where Sri Lanka is heading. So it's really up to the public to look at the manifesto, to listen to the speeches, to read the interviews, and decide for yourself if the NPP presents a realistic avenue to debt sustainability and economic development. And as the representative of the SJB, let me just finish by saying that the reason that many of us will be supporting and voting for Mr. Sajith Premadasa is simply because he represents an exit from the old neoliberal way of thinking of Sri Lanka's economy. But he doesn't represent a departure from the liberal democratic values that have defined our country for decades. Our country is one of the oldest democratic nations in this part of the world. We should be proud of that fact. We heard yesterday a very prominent politician from the NPP talking about dissolving parliament the day after the election without any conversation about the constitutional manner in which we achieve that. I don't think you've heard Mr. Premadasa make such wild statements thus far in 2 years. Every statement that Mr. Premadasa makes, whether it was about economic Armageddon, whether it was about the provision of sanitary napkins, whether it was about an extra tax slab, whether it was about a more equitable tax structure, all of this has come to pass. Now the question is whether we stick with what this opposition has been saying all along, that Sri Lanka has to chart an alternative path that includes the IMF, that includes all sectors and segments of our population, and presents a plan that has wide acceptance amongst all Sri Lankans and doesn't only cater to the business community or doesn't only cater to special interests in the government, but takes into account everybody's dreams and hopes in this country. I'll close by saying that this is a presidential election, but go back to what I said at the beginning, that there is no time for demagoguery. So unless you expect one single person, even as an extremely powerful executive, to handle all the executive functions, including defense, finance, and the environment, I think this is unrealistic. You have to elect a president that is able to lead a team that has a wide variety of experience and has shown some record of public service. So I think when you consider those things, Mr. Premadasa becomes a very easy option and a very pragmatic and realistic option. So I urge the voters at home, first of all, to consider your vote very carefully, and second of all, to ensure that nobody enters the voting booth as a low information voter. There is no excuse in this day and age for being a low information voter. And absolutely too much hinges on you taking in as much information as you can before you vote. So please take the time in the next 2 to 3 weeks, familiarize yourself with all aspects of the parties and candidates and their manifestos, and give yourself some time to think rationally about the public and policy statements being made.
You're watching the Lifetraveler channel.